Welcome to the Fireside Chat at IQVIA News. We have one of the business leader, Amit Mookim, who is the president of TIE Mumbai and managing director of IQVIA, a Fortune 500 organization and a leading healthcare information, technology, and research organization, as a guest today. Hello and a warm welcome to you, Amit.
Thank you, Kalpana. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you today for me as well. All right, Amit, my first question is, India's GDP contraction was worse than any of the world's biggest economies. With a slew of government initiatives, how do you expect the Indian economy to shape up over the next few quarters? And what are your expectations from the government?
So I think, Kalpana, what obviously happened, if we break it down between supply and demand related pushes, the first few months of the lockdown obviously saw a supply related contraction, right? Because of logistics being clammed up. And then we were expecting that as the supply constraints went off, demand would not pick up as much as it would. But apart from a few sectors which have naturally got impacted because of this situation, we've seen a great pickup in demand across sectors, right? Which is very encouraging from the Indian economy's perspective. But when I speak of healthcare, of course, one of the areas that did get impacted was patients postponing their procedures, not going to hospitals for fear of infections, as well as moving forward some of the important electives that they had to. Now, while that has seen a comeback, I think that is something which has a downstream impact on economy because we will just increase the cost of care. Now, from the government's point of view, I think it's also a wait and watch, and there are many variables that are still unknown, right? When I look at India, and when we looked at the progression of the disease, India is not one country. It is a conglomeration of 31 different units that behave very differently at any point of time, with different health infrastructure, with different demographics, right? And hence the challenges are even more. So I personally feel that the next year is also a wait and watch year on many fronts. The next year is an important year because there are certain developments that are taking place right now, and the outcome of those developments we will only know next year as they come across. But so far, I am quite optimistic that we are moving forward in the right direction, despite the infrastructure challenges and the vast we have, which would have made managing this pandemic much more difficult than any other country.
So many say that great companies often come out during market downturns. How have you seen entrepreneurship excelled over the last few months?
If we look at what has happened with respect to a few sectors, especially engineering, automotive, transportation, one of the things which we saw was many large companies stepped up to the challenge of providing for infrastructure that was required to address the pandemic. So we had a few engineering and automotive companies produce ventilators. We created in a very short time one of the largest supply bases of PPE kits, diagnostic kits, right? Which is unprecedented. It's not happened that we've got the entire ecosystem come together. We saw the whole retail model pivot, both between online and offline, right? And India emerged as one of the fastest growing economies for e-commerce, whether it was grocery or whether it was anything else. From a pharma perspective, we saw companies actually work much closely on adoption of digital, right? And when doctors were not being able to see patients physically, we saw the explosion of telemedicine and remote consultations. And the government also stepped in and created the right regulatory frameworks to enable something like this. So I think, the quick adoption of digital, especially in a country that was very, very largely physical. And if we look at what happened on the education front, right, and especially the big challenge we face on educational infrastructure and how, right from state operated schools to private schools, the adoption of technology has taken place. I think some of it may reverse to some extent. I think some of it has been permanent changes where models have pivoted in terms of how content as well as services have been consumed digitally. And it's a step forward for our country, by no means.
So COVID-19 impacted the startups and small businesses brutally. How do you see these businesses overcoming the challenges posed by the pandemic and demand disruption?
So Kalpana, this actually is something we have been discussing in TIE as well. And I think, the bedrock of the Indian economy is the medium, small enterprises, the SME sector, the MSME sector, right? While India is a large base of entrepreneurial activity on technology and global offshoring and outsourcing and everything else, I think when we look at the brick and mortar and when we look at the SME sector, there has been a huge impact on working capital, on demand, on infrastructure and everything else. And one of the things I think will need to be probably thought through is how do some of these MSMEs and SMEs get support on financing and continuity of business? How could there be knowledge and exchanges where they could even pivot their model? So for example, today, somebody who was running a restaurant, right, could they pivot their model to a cloud kitchen? Could they pivot a model to something else, right? Where because the demand for that particular outlet may not be what it was 6 to 8 months ago, right? Or for someone who was in the business of travel, right, where the travel entirely has gone through. What else could they do with the skill set that they have? And at TIE, we've been thinking about how we could create some of these programs, but this is a real challenge to be addressed. I don't think there's any simple answer to this, but all we feel is that this sector is actually the largest employer in the country on both the organized and unorganized base. And while there has been an entire push with foreign investment coming in, an entire push towards organization of certain sectors, we don't want the focus to move away from this. So we've been working along with other agencies, along with non-profits, thinking through what needs to be done to support this sector.
So please elaborate on top 5 priorities and focus areas of TIE over the next 2 years.
Yeah, sure. So Kalpana, I think one thing which we talked about, on the whole MSME, SME is one. And I think TIE being a global non-profit and an institution that stands on the bedrock of mentoring, networking, supporting entrepreneurial activity, will play a pivot role in actually creating opportunities, making some of these MSMEs look for new ideas, get funding, find co-founders and pivot their model. So that is one. I think the other thing is, the pandemic has taught us that no business is local. And, at the same time, the playground for a lot of opportunities have become global. And we will see many, many global companies coming into India, and we will also see an opportunity for Indian companies to go global. However, I think one of the things that continuously needs to be done is how do we create the right environment for some of these Indian companies to scale up, right? Build their profile in the global environment, network with other geographies. And this is where the global network of TIE can play a massive role with our chapters in the Silicon Valley, in Israel, in Boston, in London, in Singapore, which is a fintech hub, where we started exchange programs for entrepreneurs over the last few years. We want to really ramp that up because now physical movement is no longer a barrier, right? So that's the second piece. I think the third thing we really want to do is figure out a way in which we focus on 3 or 4 areas that we feel are going to really push forward innovation and growth in the Indian economy. Areas around transportation, renewable and clean energy, around deep tech, ed tech, fintech, health. And one of the things TIE has been doing very successfully is globally has been creating special interest groups, which is really communities of like-minded entrepreneurs who come from a certain industry background and work for the growth and development for that particular area. So the 4 or 5 areas I called out are the areas where we want to really bring and foster not only Mumbai based but national and international knowledge exchange in communities, so that some of the the areas can not only spawn Indian businesses, but to really grow these opportunities then become global opportunities. So for example, let me take healthcare, where I'm part of healthcare today. One of the things India needs to do is really champion affordable innovation for global markets, right? That is where the industry will grow, because if you look at it, there are very few billion-dollar companies in healthcare in India today, right? And why is that the case when healthcare itself is such a large industry? So that has to happen, and that can only happen when agencies like us can create a platform for companies, entrepreneurs, angels, and VCs of a certain knowledge base and sector to come together and really push forward that agenda. So that's the other thing we want to do. And the last thing we want to do is, given the excellent representation we have amongst the board, the charter members, the VCs and angels, is really think through and support the government on certain regulations, incentive structures, and enablers that need to happen. So let me give you an example. What is happening today, if you look at it globally, is that clusters of innovation are being set up. So you have an entire corner in London where innovation is happening, or in Bristol, or in Boston, where pockets of innovation hubs are being set up, which is physical infrastructure, accelerators, the integration of academia as well as government and entrepreneurs to actually grow innovation and then make it really scalable. And that is what I think even some of our cities need. And Mumbai needs it, because Mumbai today is at a point where the costs of living, the costs of setting up a business are quite high. And we really need to figure out a way in which the supreme talent and the financial hub that Mumbai is can really leverage growth of these businesses. So that's the other thing we want to do.
So COVID-19 induced lockdown and its aftermath has spelled an elongated period of uncertainty for many businesses. How is TiE Mumbai playing an instrumental role in allaying the troubles of businesses?
So there are various aspects we have been trying to address, and over the last 7 months, more than 25,000 entrepreneurs, startups have attended the hundreds of webinars that we've done. And the topics of webinars have ranged from building resilience in entrepreneurship, managing mental health and well-being, managing cash flow, preserving cash, looking at new business ideas, bringing in trade bodies from other countries, whether it's in Israel or a UK or US, to look for Indian startups, looking at opportunities there, teaching them how to pitch to investors, as well as for lots of investors, teaching them this art and science of investing. So we've been playing a extremely active role in bringing in some of this knowledge as well as opportunities in front of the startup ecosystem, because we know that at this point of time, a lot of what people need is the access to new ideas, new networks, as well as the ability to think through some quick solutions that can keep their business going. I'll give you a statistic which I was reading somewhere, that there was a report that was done where it was found out that many founders had reached a point where they just had a few months of working capital. Right now, working capital is so important in the initial few years of a startup, and COVID-19 literally wiped out the cash flow situation in the way it was planned. Right now, we did webinars on that front. The other piece that lost a lot of ground was confidence building between investors and their investee companies, which really means that how do you continuously be transparent and communicate to your investors on an ongoing basis to make sure that they are supporting your journey. And if there's a breakdown of that trust, how do you deal with that, right? Because you're in a situation where you may not get the access to free capital that is. So this is what we've been doing, really bringing in very real issues and having a forum for discussing.
That's really nice. You are the board of several national industry forums on healthcare and venture investing, and you mentor startups and actively promote the cause of entrepreneurship and innovation in healthcare. So, according to you, how technology can help government in reaching population once the COVID-19 vaccine is available, especially in the initial phase of it?
So, the technology will play a massive role here, Kalpana. And it plays a role in 3 or 4 aspects. See, one is the vaccine that we have will require an end-to-end infrastructure of logistics that can track and trace how the vaccine is moving, because the vaccine can change only so many hands. It needs to be stored at a particular temperature, beyond which it may not be effective. It needs to reach the right point. It needs to be administered, right? Technology plays a huge role, and tracking and tracing as well as cold chain technology is one aspect of it. I think the second aspect of it is really working through how you utilize and deploy the vaccine, right? Because today, if you look at the numbers that have been talked about, there is going to be a certain percentage of the population that will get inoculated over a period of time, right? Now, how do you create those rules? How do you track them? How do you manage the data sets? And as well as how do you create a payment mechanism so that no fraud or misuse of something like this happens? There again, technology plays a role, where the connectivity as well as registration of these patients and tracking how the vaccine has been taken would need to be tracked, because there is a quarantine period, especially if there's a booster shot, right? So that's the second piece. I think the third piece is adverse event tracking, because there are so many unknowns relating to effectiveness, long-term tenure of the vaccine. It's very important to track what the outcomes and adverse events are going to be, right, over a period of time. And there again, technology plays a role, especially on a large base like this, where one will need to feed back in any such events that are taking place that the government may need to course correct. So to me, we cannot do this mammoth task in such an accelerated way without technology, whether it's data sets, whether it's the cold chain infrastructure, whether it's the adverse event reporting, whether it's a connectivity right down to the center which is going to be vaccinated and creating those health records there.
So you mean that it has to be in collaboration with government has to definitely collaborate with the private, and it will be complete collaboration between public and private to post-vaccination period, where we can actually go through this journey of post-COVID-19.
Absolutely, Kalpana. I think look, the collaboration has been happening even through this time, right? Where the private sector has stepped in. Lots of COVID centers were being managed by the private sector. The supply chain and logistics companies, there are so many innovative companies that are there. So I don't think that it is an either or situation. I think here it has to be the combined efforts. Obviously, given the sensitivity of this whole situation, I would expect that the government would drive a lot of the thinking and policy making around this, right? Because there has to be a method in which you really drive the vaccination of the people, whether they are healthcare workers or certain critical parts of the population. And there you need an august body and a regulatory aspect to overlay, pure play commercial considerations. So I think that oversight has to be there, but I do not think that this can be done completely on an individual basis, especially given the expanse that we have.
Yeah, and then they're definitely the government can't take the whole cost burden also. I think the cost has also to be taken, has to be divided between the corporates, the employers, and of course the government has to take care of the poor people, and there could be philanthropic agencies also who would help. So what are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts, Kalpana, on this, and I'll make it broader than vaccine. I think a country that we are, where the infrastructure is still developing, the income segments are so widespread, the tax base is so meager, that putting the burden, although I think the implementation design of healthcare has to be driven at the government and the state level, but the reality of the situation is, I think a tiered healthcare system will continue to exist in India to make sure that universal healthcare happens, right? I don't think it's realistic to assume that we will achieve universal healthcare completely by only one party. It may turn out to be closer to an Australian system, where you have a copay as well as the public health infrastructure, and that may be the right model for India for some time, right? Given the infrastructure we have. I also feel that the innovation, the disruptive innovation, the affordable innovation does come out of entrepreneurship, right? And India has been a base for entrepreneurship, and in healthcare it's much more required. What I really am encouraged by, and the government has started to do this, is create platforms for innovation and access, where we take in entrepreneurship as well as innovation from the private sector, from startups, and bring in mainstream into the public health system. Now, when that starts to happen, then you really got a true partnership going. Then it's not two markets or two players sitting side by side, but it's really taking some of the innovation that can make healthcare much more scalable and accessible.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Amit. It was a complete pleasure interacting with you. We got some great insights and really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kalpana. It was a pleasure speaking to you too. Have a great day. Thank you.
You too. Thank you, everyone. Please follow #DigitalDisruptors and stay tuned to our social media channels for more updates. Stay safe and take care.